Welcome to Association Chat, your place to find out everything you wanted to find out about associations, the association industry, association trends, things that are happening with associations, and more. I'm the host of Association Chat, Kiki L'Italien, and today is a very special Association Chat. I know I say that all the time, but we're talking about trends transforming academic conferences. Now, this is something that is not widely spoken about in great circles. This is definitely one of those topics where it's a niche audience that is going to be drawn in by just that title. But there's something for all of us to learn. And today I want to invite in my special guest, Laura Harvey. And you are the is it COO, CTO, COO?
CCO, so Chief Customer
CCO.
Officer.
CCO, yes, for Ex Ordo. And she's going to talk with us today about some of these trends, some of the changes that are happening, and why we need to pay attention to those things. And so, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today and to just get into this, because I know there's been so much excitement about event format and live events versus digital events and hybrid events and whether we should do them, but maybe not as much attention paid to some of the trends that are happening with some of those scholastic conferences or the learned community and how they are convening. So let's go into the trends with those. And I thought maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview about your background and why you're the one that's here talking with us today.
Sure. So yeah, thank you for having me. Really excited to get into this rich niche topic today. So I have a chemistry background many years ago. So chemistry is what I studied at college, and I really loved working on research, essentially. Cutting edge research. I like to learn. I like to see how the field is progressing, but I didn't really like lab work. So when it came to choosing a career, I was keen to find an option that would allow me to work around the research lifecycle and work in academia, but not actually be an academic. And the path I chose was initially scholarly publishing. So I started out in the books and journals space at a commercial publisher, and eventually moved on to a society publisher based in the UK. Shout out to the British Institute of Radiology. So they are, scholarly society of many years standing, and they are quite a great example because they have a publications team, they have an events team, they have a membership team, like a lot of associations all across the world. So I worked in their publications team for many years, and then I moved into the service provider space within the scholarly industry. So I moved on to Clarivate, where I was working on a number of workflow tools that support scholarship. So things like journal submission systems, peer review recognition systems, marketing tools, again, all aimed at that really specific subspace of publishers, event providers, scholarly societies, really working with specific subject area fields, so academic topics. And then at the start of this year, I joined Ex Ordo. So I started my role in January of this year. The scholarly event space particularly is something I worked across to some degree while I was at Clarivate. But obviously in the last couple of years, including the pandemic, it's a space that's seen a significant amount of transformation. And from a workflow perspective, the rapid digitalization of events, particularly content-heavy events like scholarly events, opened up a bunch of possibilities that really did seem quite far away back in 2019, and that really excited me. And I wanted to make my next step in a role that was much more events specific, which is one of the many reasons I chose to join Ex Ordo. So Ex Ordo is a scholarly events workflow provider. So our core business is scholarly events. Events is our bread and butter. It's the core thing that we care about. And we work with specifically scholarly event organizers on helping, essentially supporting them and their workflow from planning all the way up to kind of hosting and delivering the event.
Right. And when we talked before, you were I forget what the metaphor was for this whole workflow, something like I don't want to take it away from you, but you'll have to share the story about, maybe workflow is not everyone's cup of tea, or it's not their passion, but for you it's a little bit different, right?
That's true, yes. I think the analogy was plumbing.
Yes, that's
Not
it.
everyone finds plumbing sexy, but it is very important, and you
It
know
is
that when
very
it goes wrong. So I find workflow solutions generally that they are my passion. It's a passion shared by all of my colleagues. And it's one of those things that you kind of notice the most when it's not working. But
right.
you can kind of, from the inside, you can really see the power of it and connecting various things together and making sure it's seamless and invisible and it works really well. So for me, it very much is a passion, but I understand for everybody, it's not necessarily the sexiest topic, but I do think it's extremely powerful. And I think there's a lot of potential there, particularly for scholarly events workflow, which hopefully we'll get in today.
Well, for scholarly events, I mean, because this is your focus, this is something that you're in every single day. You're focused on this whole area, and if anyone's going to notice trends or things that are impact themes that you're seeing running through these events, it's going to be you. And so let's talk about some of these major trends that you're observing in the scholarly event space today. Like, what are some of those things that just come to mind immediately?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I spent a lot of time trying to kind of think, okay, there's so much there. What's the best way for me to kind of answer this at a high level? And maybe we can get into some of the details a little bit later on. So I think the way I find it helpful to think about is thinking about the event lifecycle in three stages. You've got your kind of planning and organization stage, your actual hosting and running the event stage, and then your post-event stage. And it obviously kind of goes round in a circle. And I think there are some really key emerging trends we're seeing kind of specific to each stage. So I guess I'll just take you through each one, like high level stuff. So for the planning stage, we're really seeing a lot of scholarly event organizers increasingly focusing on the financial elements and the profitability of events. Now, obviously, that's not new. Events have always had budgets, but in the last couple of years, partly driven by the transition to open access from a scholarly society perspective, but also from a cost of living, cost of doing business perspective as well, and obviously the changes in the pandemic. There's a lot of focus on event revenue, either turning a profit or at least coming in at a either specified loss or a net neutral for the sake of society sustainability. So we're seeing a lot more focus on those elements in the planning stages. Perhaps unsurprisingly, some kind of truly interdisciplinary, not even scholarly specific topics like sustainability, DEI, accessibility, really coming up again and again, which in many ways is really great to see. But it's obviously an additional kind of piece of work and challenge for event organizers. But we're seeing those being incorporated, further and further in advance in the planning stages, which is interesting. From a topic perspective, we can get into this in a little bit later, but AI is, a big one we're seeing coming up. It's working its way onto the content agenda for a wide spread of events across a wide spread of topics.
Surprised. I'm not surprised.
Not surprised at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also touching some of the sort of planning and running conversations. So how can it be used in processes and tools to help event organizers? I'd say those are quite nascent conversations. Most of what sort of I'm seeing anecdotally is really about the content of what delegates will be talking about or listening about or want to hear about. And then a couple of other things on the planning stage. So research integrity is a really specific scholarly trend that we're starting to see emerge on the event side. So it's a really big topic generally within the scholarly industry, particularly on the publication side. So lots of concerns around recent mass retractions and research misconduct issues. And obviously every time that happens, it chips away at the confidence in essentially the world's knowledge base. And I think the the kind of rapid digitization of scholarly events in the last couple of years it's brought many benefits, and it's also brought the realization of how crucial scholarly events are in the cycle of, an idea through to a piece of research through to its impact. And events will kind of touch that piece of research's journey at many different points. And unfortunately, there are bad actors out there that do try and exploit entry points to, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this, to kind of get work which is not legitimately conducted, for example, into the corpus of the world's knowledge. So we're seeing a lot of event organizers starting to think about how they can guard against that, check for that, things like that earlier on in the process.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is trust is one of my favorite topics to talk about, because it's something that I think in this day and age, for so many reasons, not just AI. Before this, it was like, what is like this idea of alternate facts and all this stuff. What is the truth? What are we looking at as the source of truth? And in the association world, certainly that ability to provide content, material, resources, knowledge that can be relied upon, that is trustworthy, that is high quality, is all something that's very important, and something that obviously happens with academic conferences and any sort of scholarly events. So with this idea of research integrity sort of being under fire, not sort of being under fire, and influencing, the planning and the execution of scholarly events. How are you seeing that play out? Like, what does that look like when you're looking at that sort of life cycle of how all of this stuff comes together?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is I think we really are at the early stages. These are, from an events perspective, what we're seeing anecdotally, it's the start of conversations around, is this an issue for
Mhm.
events? Is this an issue for our events? How is it flowing downstream? Any organization that is in the business of scholarship generally, but sort of output and publications, including conference publications specifically, in some ways, is a steward of the world's knowledge. And that's something that is front and center for publications departments, for sure, and has been for a number of years for various reasons, but high profile cases of research misconduct, particularly. I think what we're starting to see with the events piece is twofold. There's a kind of quality assurance element. So that's adjacent to research integrity. It's not quite the same. It's not necessarily preventing misconduct, but it's making sure that, how do we make sure the quality of our events and the content is where we want it to be as Society X, and how do we make sure that scales, which is hugely challenging. But then, one other element of that is, how do we make sure this is all valid, even
Mhm.
quality level aside? Like, how do we make sure this is a legitimate researcher with a legitimate piece of research discussion topic and so on, and that this actually happened. It actually happened at our event and was presented and discussed and so on. So, I mean, I really think we're at the point where people on the event side are clarifying how the events workflow kind of trickles downstream to their publications workflow, which is where a lot of
Mhm.
the research integrity attention has stemmed from historically. And we're also seeing, I'd say, just lots of fact finding around, what can we check? What can we look at? How do we measure quality? Questions like that. I think there's a whole raft of possibilities about where this could go. But I think from an events industry perspective, we're really at the beginning, which is quite exciting, but it's daunting as well. There's a lot to unpack.
Well, yeah, like, so let's venture into the daunting territory and explore some of those challenges. What are some of the key challenges that are faced when going into this planning of scholarly events?
So I think from a quality perspective, I mean, in many ways, it depends on scale.
Mhm.
Quality is difficult. Quality is subjective. Obviously, peer review plays a big part there. So the whole, attracting quality submissions for your event is one piece, but making sure that your peer review workflow and your peer reviewers and your chairs or your editors are all on the same page in terms of what you're trying to achieve, what the quality standards are, and that the process actually works. And obviously, like all events, it's very time sensitive.
Mhm.
You have a specific cutoff date of when you need to kind of have all of that done. And that's challenging enough for a few small events. If you're a large event provider or we're talking about a huge event with lots of submissions, that's very, very challenging. And event teams specifically, in-house teams, they tend to be relatively small, relatively compact with a lot to oversee. So it's not really feasible to check everything right on a paper by paper or submission by submission basis. So I think that's one of the challenges, is just making sure that the quality standards for a particular event, whatever they may be, from the society level, are clear and transparent to everybody involved in the process, from the submitter, the author, to the reviewer, to the chair, to whoever makes the decision. And then how can that be checked? Because that, this is an inherent like quality peer review issue. It happens across journals as well. But I think for events, slightly different content, you're under a time pressure that you're not necessarily under for journals. So there's that added kind of constraint, I would
Right.
say, is one big piece. And then the other piece, again, just like on the publication side, is really a know your customer problem.
Mhm.
So being confident that the person you think is your author or your reviewer, maybe less so your program chair, but again, interested in examples from the community, I'm sure it does happen that those folk are the people you think they are.
Yes.
Or whether they're not people you've worked with before, but knowing that those are legitimate researchers in your specific topic area or field. And you do get examples of both. So essentially accounts spoofing the identity of legitimate researchers, or accounts pretending to be a legitimate researcher when actually none of the research associated with name, email address
Oh
is
my
in fact
gosh.
legit. So there's that piece as well, which is again very analogous to what you sometimes see on the journal side.
What a
But it's
nightmare. I mean, I think back to I'm sorry to interrupt. I
no
like
problem.
I think back to when I a long time ago worked for directly for an association, and the last association that I was an actual employee of, they had the peer reviewed journal, they had the scholarly events with uh, all kinds of we had scientists that were on staff to help like advise us, and yet at that time it was still kind of in the beginning of social media really taking off and being used for community building and things like that. The ability for people to spoof and spam and create junk and a whole lot of fake background that at first glance, at the first blush, might pass. The ability to do that at scale now it's so simple. It's so much easier now than it used to be. I cannot even imagine what people are trying to deal with in combating that and making sure that nothing filters through.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of escalated that. And I know there's been a lot of really interesting conversation around generative AI in terms of content generation,
Yeah.
which I'm by no means an expert on, but that's obviously a concern for any workflow through which content flows, be it an event, a journal, a digital library. The thing I think is, if anything, my personal opinion, possibly a slightly bigger worry in our specific space, is the content that flows through those systems that isn't typically seen. So if you
Mm.
have generated a fake submission, let's say using ChatGPT or Bard, at some point, you know, your ultimate purpose will be to have that out there in the wild that people can see, and that's a publication or a proceeding or a hit against your profile that you want to kind of leverage. And in many ways, you're banking on that hiding in plain sight, because there's so much content out there that who's going to actually look at it and at some point realize this isn't a legitimate piece of research. And it's getting harder and harder to do that, obviously, as the tools get better. And but the thing that's also really worrying is, what about peer review comments? Those
Right.
typically aren't, for the most part, still, you know, a lot of that happens in a blind or double blind fashion. It sits within siloed systems. How much harder would it be if you fed the thing that you're meant to be reviewing to an LLM, asked it to generate a review or summary for you, and just copy and pasted that back? Like, would it? My personal instinct is that that would be even harder for people to spot
Absolutely.
than
Who's gonna
say
go
if you
back
look
and
at.
yeah, it's like you're expecting somebody to go back and, like, really inquire and dig into the comments that are made, and at that point, you know, it's like, how many times back are you gonna check it? How far back can you possibly go? And, you know, and still be able to detect when it happens. It's such a good point. I mean,
I mean, yeah, I'm sort of veering us slightly off topic here. Peer review is another one of my
yeah, right,
passions
right.
from a former role, but yeah,
We could do
it's
peer review, a whole other
a
show
whole
just
peer
on
review
that.
show.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's not events exclusive, for
Right.
sure. I mean, it's scholarly specific.
Mhm.
But I mean, I guess returning to your original question about trends, you know, I think all of that stuff was kind of pre-event. If you're thinking about, you know, when you're running the event and the trends that happen there, what's really interesting in what we're seeing, as well as continued focused on things like sustainability and accessibility and DEI, is the focus on the in-person experience post-pandemic, now that we're a couple of years into physical events, as well as kind of the enhancing virtual elements, seeing how organizers are changing the way they run events or they structure programs to get basically to make sure that the thing you get from the physical experience is something only a physical experience can deliver, and the stuff that
Yeah,
you can get from a virtual experience is something that translates really well.
yeah.
So things like celebration and networking and fun and community, and kind of building a bit more of the physical experience around that, which I think, as we probably all learned in 2020, amongst other things, is something that's quite hard to translate online. Whereas there are some elements of a conference, like maybe some of the interactive elements, some of the just kind of consuming content elements that do translate very well. So we're seeing a lot of scholarly events make that split slightly differently than maybe was done in 2021, 2020,
Mhm.
which is really interesting. And then for post events, I think this is where, if anything, if I were to pick, you know, what's the big trend in scholarly events recently, for me, it's all post event downstream would be
Oh,
the big
okay.
one, because so much of what happens at an event previously would have been in person. You were in person, you saw it, you heard it, you listened to it, and then it ends. And you take it away with you in your memory and your notes, and maybe some of that was digital, but the majority wouldn't have been. And then in the space of about a year, most of that changed. Like, it was a digital transformation for the events industry on a time scale that just I don't think any other industry really saw, or at least historically hasn't seen. And for scholarly events specifically, which are very content rich,
Mhm.
there's so much opportunity. So what we're seeing now is there's, you know, lots of associations that digitized their events successfully in 2020, 2021. They now have video content, engagement data, they have, you know, lectures, they've got all of that recorded, or they've got the kind of full transcript, and they've got all of this content that they are now kind of looking at how can they use, how can I extend the life of the event, how can I take this content and turn it into an asset that can benefit the society. I know you wanted to get on this later, but I think that for me is the big trend we're seeing from association events specifically, is like suddenly realizing there's this kind of corpus of additional content they wouldn't have had 5 or 6 years ago,
Yes.
using to build on it, basically to enhance community experience and, you know, the health of the organization.
Well, and so can we talk a little bit more about that? Because I know that we're almost half an hour in, and I want to really talk about that content piece, because I think that this idea that there is so much potential and so much possibility in what organizations can do with the content that they, and the video and the audio and the all of the materials that they will be able to acquire from a conference. Are they actually doing what they can do? I mean, the trend is definitely that they're capturing. You know, we saw that they needed to, and they needed to create this virtual component. Certainly, going through the pandemic years when there was no choice, but then coming out of that, are you seeing them continue to take that on and then use that content the way that they should? It certainly has been a transformation for some, but what's your take on it as far as observations from those organizations that you're working with?
So, I mean, what I'm about to say is anecdotal for sure, and of the events industry more generally, not just our specific set of customers. But I think that quote about any kind of change or development, I think it's, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. Um, that's very much true, right? We're still talking about a lot of recent change, organizationally. You're talking the last couple of years, which, considering everything else that lots of organizations are battling with, is not a very long period of time. Are we seeing societies and associations actually utilize the additional content they now find them with? Yes. Is everyone doing it? No. Is everyone doing it the same way? No. So I think most of the associations that I speak to and that I hear from, and that the kind of I see information from, it's definitely on the radar. It's definitely on the agenda.
Mhm.
Some have been able to move on it, some haven't. There are a couple of different flavors of how this looks. So there's, I think, the first step typically is creating, if you're thinking about video content of some kind from an event, like an online library. So something that either members can access or you can sell as an on-demand version of the event, and maybe enhance it and kind of shorten it, or things like that. So that's one thing. There's a kind of further downstream element of that, which is further enhancing that content into things like learning materials or training materials or courses. So we've certainly I've sort of heard and seen examples of some specific lectures or sessions being turned into, like Q&As, where you can kind of take a course on the society's learning module that's informed by content from the event, and then you get your CPD point or your certificates, which I think is a really interesting one. The other kind of, I think, less explored option, but something we're really interested in, is taking the content and the engagement from an event and seeing how that can translate into things that the society already does. So either membership offerings or particularly publication offerings as well, because it's kind of almost a continuation of the research life cycle. To my knowledge, that isn't something that happens systematically at scale anywhere, but it's certainly, I think, a really interesting one. If you think about, an event, you've got a specific audience that's aligned with your specific subject area or area of expertise in your mission. If you have a publications outlet, that will obviously be, there's a huge overlap there, and every person at that scholarly event potentially is somewhere along the research life cycle with some piece of research, or even if it's not research, if it's an opinion piece or a review article of some kind, like some piece of scholarship, and there's probably multiple per attendee, and working out how the events piece and the publications piece can be connected together so that the publications piece can benefit from the events piece, and also the events and audience attendees can kind of benefit from that connection too, right?
Right.
So I think that's another huge one that maybe is a little bit more nascent, but you certainly see things like video libraries and learning tools. A lot of societies engaging with those. There are a couple of providers out there, like Cadmore, Underline, Cassini to some extent, or that's slightly different, who've all kind of built out over the last couple of years to really work with societies on these sorts of issues.
Okay. So I want to actually look at how you're seeing this, because I'm getting ready to speak at this organization called PAR, their Rev Up conference, and it's happening tomorrow and the next day in Annapolis, talking about, different ways to generate revenue for associations. Certainly, associations and societies have been looking at educational content and different types of learning content as part of that cycle to create revenue. And so, from these scholarly events, the content that's all being created and the content that's being developed, how are you seeing those scholarly events being extended beyond their traditional formats for continued engagement and revenue generation? What are some of the stories that you're hearing, or some of the examples that you're seeing?
So it does depend on the specific nature of the event. So some of the events are huge, and they're very they're almost like subject level. And then you'll get some that is like topic level or issue level, and then you'll get some that are almost article level, really. And I would class that as a seminar rather than an event, but it's kind of cascading levels of detail. In terms of monetization options, so the video on demand library is a really common one that I've seen multiple societies do. So this is kind of presented in two ways. There's it's essentially a kind of translation of recorded event content that then is available later on demand, and it's either presented as a membership benefit, so it indirectly drives revenue through increased membership sales, or it's also available on almost like a per lecture or a per session purchase, so you can have like a direct revenue stream from it. And off the top of my head, like typically you'd see both. It's something that can drive membership, but it's also something that people are able to go on, I want to buy access to this for an hour and it's however much. The learning tools one, seen a couple of examples of that as well. I can't remember the name of the specific provider off the top of my head, but I will try and follow up with you later. But again, this was a kind of add-on to the video on demand offering. So it was a society, it was a British society, and I think it was British Clinical Pharmacology Society, but again, I will confirm that. They had a video on demand library from their event content. So scholarly content, training content, panel sessions, things like that. And a subset of that content, the very subject specific, often more educational events, were turned into learning modules, which could then enhance a membership offering, but they could also be a paid for add-on. So if you weren't a member, or if it was additional to your tier of membership, you could go and buy access to a particular course. And what you were watching was essentially something that had been recorded at an event, but there was almost like an MCQ test element that was available on the screen under the video that you would kind of take at the same time, and then you would get a certificate. I thought that was really interesting. It's obviously more labor intensive to put together, but it's less so than doing it from scratch. Like all of the content and the expertise and the speakers were already there. It was just about adding on that kind of digital test experience.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I mean, I think that's such a great example. And I want to actually point this out. You shared a link with me. And if people want to go into the comments section, if you're watching on YouTube, we can pronounce it many different ways, different types of inflection. But if you want to go to YouTube and look in the comments, I just posted the link and you can click on that link below. Or if you're listening to this later, check the show notes and I'll have this link in the show notes. But there's more. Laura's in this quote in this article on scholarly events. And I actually thought that this was a really great article. I was so glad that you shared it with me. Drilling down deeper into what what people are looking for when they go to these things, what they're hoping to get out of these types of events, and getting the value out of that. So much of what you're doing and so much of what you're focusing on is really that focus on value and making sure that that's there and it's easily accessible and understood to the people who are looking for content and looking for getting more out of their events. So just trying to sort of quickly wrap everything up, when we're looking at the trends, when we're looking at some of these things that we're seeing, and you in your position, you're so hyper aware of everything that's going on in this community of people who put on events like this. What do you see for the future as you're looking ahead and you're forecasting? If I were asking you to bring out your crystal ball based on the themes that we see here, where do you see things going? And I'm going to build one more on top of that. Where do you see things going? And what advice would you have? Number one piece of advice would you have for organizations that are watching and maybe thinking, okay, what do I need to pay attention to next?
Okay, so I'll leave the advice piece to the end, and I'll
Okay.
cogitate on that while I kind of talk through the predictions, I guess. So in terms of where I would predict things go, I think I see scholarly events being increasingly better integrated with the research lifecycle. So at the moment, I personally think they, if you think of like preparing to do a piece of research, publishing and sharing that piece of research, having people kind of find and discover and read that piece of research, and then having it assessed and funded and just going round and round again. Scholarly events kind of happen all over that cycle. They're not one specific point. I see the scholarly event infrastructure essentially being plumbed more effectively into the infrastructure that sits between universities and publishers and libraries and funders that kind of facilitates that life cycle. And I think that would benefit everybody. I think it is a win-win. I also see scholarly event infrastructure. So that's kind of within the ecosystem. I would see if you think within the society or within the association, better integration between the events workflow and other society workflows. So even if you're not thinking about the whole ecosystem and all the different players, you're just thinking about society for this particular topic, you've got, most likely a membership workflow, a publications workflow, maybe an education workflow, an events workflow. The reality is within most societies, a lot of that is very siloed. And even if your teams are quite small and they all talk to each other and work together well, it's still a challenge to get the data and the insights all kind of working together. I see that changing. I see, societies are already talking much more clearly about how frustrating that is and how much potential it would unlock if that was more seamless. So I'd say integrations for the first two, really connecting the events workflow to the workflow for everything else within our industry. I think a continuation of extending the life of an event. So this is the trend we were talking about, turning event content into other content or other, content that people can access for longer, and monetizing that, potentially using it to enhance publications output. I would see that going and going and going. It's already kind of a booming trend. I see that continuing. I think the other thing is really almost around the insights that you can get from an event. So we've talked about kind of connecting the workflow, and then we've talked about just extending the life of the event and how much that can be capitalized on. Events data at its core is engagement data. You're talking about people at a specific point in time all together doing stuff. And if you think about the kind of the levels you can get from that data, I think the first thing is who attended. Like, did you turn up? Did you attend? And then if you attended, like, what did you do? What sessions did you attend? Did you interact, and so on? And what did you feel? Like, were you engaged? Did you ask a question? What topics did you talk about? And so you're kind of getting, okay, were you there? What did you do? How did you feel? And then I think the next piece really is predictive. It's kind of going up the data value pyramid. Like, what are you going to do next? And that's the key piece I don't think is really unlocked. And I see that coming. Like, events data is super, super powerful. It's really rich, engagement-based data on a core market that anyone working in scholarship is interested in. So researchers, knowing if they've attended an event and what topics they engaged with, and excuse me, you know, what topics were popular, what got discussion is really interesting. But being able to know, okay, what does that mean for this group or this specific researcher? You know, there are so many possibilities. Like, would they be interested in submitting to my journal? Would they be interested in being an editor on this topic? Would they be interested in reading this piece of X? Like, it's such rich data. I see that really unlocking and people starting to incorporate that in all aspects of market intelligence, essentially. And then finally, I think a continued focus on almost like the people power of events. So I think there's a much clearer understanding now about the purpose of a physical meetup versus a virtual meetup, and I think both will continue. But the physical piece has kind of solidified as like, this is the thing where the community is coming together as well as all of the scholarly elements. So just like any event. And I think those events will shift slightly on the in-person element to celebrate and maximize that, as opposed to trying to provide the exact same experience for an in-person and a virtual delegate. I think that gap will start to widen, but I think both will persist.
Okay, well then I have to follow that up then with that final question, which is what piece of advice, right? People who are listening and they're saying, "Oh, that's a lot to think about, and I have limited time to really focus." But what big piece of advice do you have for association executives who are listening to this right now?
I would say you start at the bottom of the data pyramid and you work your way up. And the starting point is basically working out where you're at. What data from your events do you have? And if it's just who's attended, fine. If it's who's attended and what did they do, or who's attended and are they members, you know, and anything that you can get wherever you're at, I think is a place to start. But knowing that and knowing where it could go if it's fully utilized, and if you know where you are, you know what the next step could be, and that helps narrow the focus rather than thinking, you know, I think for all but a very few sections of scholarly associations will be at the point where they're able to say, right, we know who's engaged, who's doing what, and we're able to take all our events data and get full insight on this. I don't think the events industry as a whole, like, it's getting there, but I don't think we can say that this is fully widespread knowledge that any event organizer will have had their hands on. For a lot of people, it's just a case of getting it all in one place, and then it's a case of analyzing it. But I think there's so much potential. That is a valuable piece of work to focus on. So that's the kind of post-event data piece. That would be my piece of advice, is work out where you're at.
I love it.
You can get from your data and take it from there.
I love it. I mean, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I think that for me, this question of, you know, we see that there's so much capability with the technology that we have, certainly with tools like generative AI, being able to do things that we've never been able to do before. But it's almost putting the cart before the horse when we haven't even done the best that we can do with the data that we have now. So I think what I'm hearing you say consistently is, yes, we have great tools, but let's start with the data. Let's look at what you have and work our way up that data pyramid. And I love it. I think it makes so much sense. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about these trends and these things that are changing. If people want to reach out to you after this, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
My email, so it's laura@exordo.com.
Okay, very simple.
Feel free to share that in the show notes if you like, or you can go to the exordo.com website and we've a contact us form. You can get me that way as well.
I love it. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I am thrilled that Laura took the time to talk with us today. She has so much more. You should have heard our conversation when we initially spoke. We probably talked for 2 hours. It's almost a shame that the show is like as short as it is, but I have to tell you, gold here. And if there's nothing else that you take away from it, go back, listen to what she's talking about with how you are thinking about your data. If you haven't thought about all of the ways that you are incorporating some of the video, some of the content that you're getting, and the ways to think about something that's as unsexy, but very, very important as the plumbing, the actual workflows of your events. You need to be thinking about that, especially if you have, say, a scholastic, academic, scholarly for a learned society conference, and you're wanting to make the most of it. Think about this and think about the future. I hope you're going to continue to ask questions and to keep asking questions every day. Because as Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. I hope you have a great rest of the week.